F the drum. Meyer's boots crunched in the snow as his lungs began to hurt from breathing in the crisp air. His legs began to ache from carrying the boy for so long, and all he wanted to do was lay down and shut his eyes to sleep. But he knew if he did so, it would be the last thing he ever did. Asterisk Fisher, he cursed under his breath. Just weeks ago, he and his young friend Earnest had been sleeping in warm cots by the hearth of a renovated barracks in Saratov. But now they were freezing in the northern snow-covered wilderness that was Kazzan, after a disastrous defeat they had suffered at the hands of the Kazzan horde. When they were still under the command of Col Nelson Fisher, who himself was probably halfway to Ulster by now. Myers, unlike many men, were lucky as he had broken ranks when he knew the fight was lost and staggered south along with the other deserters in a desperate attempt to save themselves. Though they did not escape unharmed, Myers was reminded as he carried Earnest on his back. He then noticed his quietness and shouted with a hoarse voice, "You better not be sleeping up there." Earnest then jolted awake. "What? No, I was just resting my eyes. Can we please for the love of the gods make a fire somewhere and rest? It's been so long since I've felt warm." Myers wished to do the same, but knew what would happen if he did. He had seen those who did frozen corpses along the road. Some men even had smiles on their faces as their eyelids were frozen shut. And he did not wish to join them. No, Myers relented. "If we do, we'll end up just like those poor bastards a few miles back we saw on the side of the road. I promised your aunt I would keep you safe, even if it meant carrying your asterisk through the snow all the way back to Mayfair." Earnest rubbed his eyes and sighed heavily. "I don't know how to stay awake." Mayfair didn't know either. He lifted his arms again to adjust the grip of Earnest. He was quite heavy for a 13-year-old boy carrying a drum. "Just start talking. You can't fall asleep when you're talking." This was something Earnest was good at doing, as there were many times when the regiment wished Earnest would cease to talk. But for once Myers wished for him to do the opposite. "We've been stuck together for months. What else is there to talk about?" Myers sighed and finally spoke. "What's the first thing you're going to do when you get back?" This made Earnest smile a bit. "Well, I'm going to go to the butcher's and buy the biggest and fattest T-bone I can find. Then I'll get some groceries from the local market and find the finest milk and bread to take back home to Aunt Barbara." Myers now smiled as well at the thought of a warm steak. "Sounds expensive. I thought you've been sending all your earnings back to your aunt." Earnest replied, "I have, but I won't have to worry about money anymore. Regardless, after I come home from the market, I'll knock on my aunt's door still wearing my uniform and hug her so tightly she'll actually ask me to stop this time. While you'll be working in the fields." Myers almost turned his head. "Why would I be there?" Earnest glanced down at him. "You're going to come back with me to Mayfair, remember? To look after my aunt too. I've seen how you two have looked at one another when I was gone." Myers nodded. He couldn't help but tell Earnest that he wasn't going to stay with Barbara. It wasn't that she was poor or that she was a widow, but rather that he couldn't spare the time for her. But that didn't matter now. "Anyways," Earnest continued, "after you come home from the field, we'll sit on the porch and smoke our pipes to talk up." Myers laughed. "There's no way in the seven hells I'm letting you smoke a pipe at 13. Earnest seemed surprised. "What about when we were in that museum and you let me smoke one?" Myers recalled the event clearly, but didn't want to, as he was ashamed to admit once they took Saratov, they began looting it immediately along with all of its riches stored away in their museums. It was a shame they had to cast it all away before they burned the city to the ground and marched with whatever they could carry. "That was a special occasion, and I was drunk." Myers reflected. "Anyways," Earnest continued, again disappointed, "we'll let Aunt Barbara cook the steak to perfection the way only she knows how and sit down to eat. Then afterward I'll go upstairs and take a nice warm bath. Then retire to a nice warm bed with the finest silk sheets I had slept in months." Myers didn't say anything for a moment as he was thinking about how he never mentioned taking off his uniform. Probably because it was the proudest thing he had ever owned along with that heavy drum. Myers was also thinking about what he would do when he took furlough himself. Truth be told, he never contemplated staying in Mayfair for more than a day. He had spent the past few months with Earnest, and in truth he liked him, but he was not his father. He was considering on going to a nice whorehouse in Blackwater and blowing away his earnings until he had nothing left to show for this sorry excuse of his service. How about you? What will you do when you get back, Claude? Myers shrugged and lied. I'll go back to Anvil Creek and see my mother and my dad. It was then that a desperate cry of urgency rang out somewhere along the front red beards. Redby the entire column then mustered their strength as a horde of Kazzan cavalrymen fell upon the column armed to the teeth with lances, bows, and rifles. Myers then looked to the tree line and spotted one as he felt something was past him as he dropped Earnest and his drum in the confusion. What's happening? Earnest cried out as he tried to get up. However, Myers couldn't respond as he drew his rifle and fired upon the Kazzan horseman, whose horse let out a neigh in pain as it fell to the snow, crushing its rider beneath its weight. The rest of the column, too weak to fight, was attempting to surrender as the Kazzans cut them down. Myers turned back to Earnest, and tragedy was there to meet him, as he found that the whizzing noise from earlier was none other than a bullet that pierced the young boy's heart. He then leaned down to him and attempted to help him, but Earnest was beyond that now and only muttered, "Take the drum to Aunt Barbara and Anne," was all he could say before he then closed his weary eyes and let sleep overtake him as warm blood stained his proud blue uniform. Myers felt as if he had received a bullet as well as he was staring into his little friend's eyelids and felt warm tears stain his face. Before he recalled the battle still occurring around him, and he grabbed the drum and stared at the young man known as Ernest Conway before he ran deep into the wilderness. He had no idea where he was going, but he ran for his life past the pine trees of the woods and felt the sound of the battle grow dimmer and dimmer, until he heard hoofprints behind him and shouting in an incoherent language. He had no hope to outrun the Kazzan men on horseback, but he would try. He then spotted a frozen river and ran as hard as he could to it while he heard shots ring out over his head. His boots hit the ice with a crunch but slipped and fell as he hit his leg on this and the drum flew from his weary arms. He then looked back and saw in horror as a Kazzan man with a fiery red beard rode at him in a fury with his saber drawn, only for him and his horse to crash through the ice with a terrible neigh and scream following them. Myers then remained there in disbelief but alive as he watched the ice break up around him. He then slowly stood up and grabbed the drum as he walked to the other side of the river. He walked for several hours before he spotted the familiar glow of a campfire, and he staggered into the small camp to find hundreds of Ulstermen like himself huddled around the fires outside of their tents and looked no differently to him when he emerged from the woodline. When sunset turned to dusk, he found himself in a tent along with the others and sat in a place amongst them to lay down. It was here that he finally noticed an asterisk bullet hole in the drum along with something else inside, something gleaming even in this lamplight. He then began to undo the stitching of the drum that was loose from months of use and began to laugh madly when it came off as he realized why that smart little boy was never going to let his aunt work again. As before him the golden and jeweled crown of the High King of Kazzan and other great treasures that were stolen from Saratov were now in his hands. Earnest had stolen it in the museum and was going to give it to her to afford that steak and anything else she had desired.